I've always thought libraries were the safest spaces in the world, but something happened some years back that changed how I feel about them. My name is Lena, I'm 26, and at the time this happened I was finishing a graduate architecture program while working part-time for a design firm downtown. That semester was brutal. I was overloaded with studio deadlines, technical reports, and presentations that seemed to stack on top of each other every single week. I'd usually leave work exhausted, grab something quick to eat, and head straight to campus to keep working until late. The university library became my second apartment during that period. It was one of those huge concrete buildings from the 70s with endless rows of shelves and entire sections hardly anyone used anymore. The upper floors stayed open until midnight, and because my apartment was shared with two musicians who practiced constantly, the library was the only place I could actually focus. That night, rain hammered the windows almost non-stop. By around 9:30 p.m., the building still had a decent number of people scattered around. Students were typing furiously, carrying stacks of books around, whispering in corners, the usual atmosphere during finals season. I settled into a long wooden table near the archive wing on the 4th floor because it was quieter there. The archive section always felt strange after dark. The lighting was dimmer than the rest of the building, and the shelves were taller and packed tightly together. You couldn't see more than a few aisles ahead at any time. Even small noises echoed strangely there. But it was secluded, and secluded was exactly what I wanted that night. Around 10:45, I noticed most people had started leaving. I had headphones on while reviewing building diagrams when someone pulled out the chair diagonally across from me. I looked up and saw a man, maybe in his early 30s, setting down a messenger bag and a single notebook. He smiled politely, almost too politely, like he had rehearsed it beforehand. What immediately stood out to me was that the entire area around us was practically empty. There were at least 20 open tables nearby, yet he chose mine. I nodded once and went back to work, hoping he'd keep to himself. For a few minutes, he just sat there, flipping through an empty notebook, without writing anything. Then he cleared his throat softly and asked if I happened to know where the economics journals were kept. The question caught me off guard because we were nowhere near that department's materials. I told him I wasn't sure and pointed vaguely toward the lower floors. He laughed quietly and said he was always getting lost in this building. Something about the laugh felt forced, but I said nothing. I returned to my laptop, but I could feel him looking at me every so often. You know when somebody's gaze keeps pulling your attention, even when you're trying to ignore it. That's exactly what it felt like. A few minutes later, he asked what I was studying. I gave a vague answer and kept typing. Then he said, "You seem like someone who notices details." That sentence bothered me immediately. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way he said it so casually. I laughed awkwardly and tried steering the conversation back towards studying, but he kept asking little questions. What year was I in? Did I stay on campus late often? Did I usually work on this floor? None of the questions were outright threatening. That's what made it hard to justify my discomfort to myself at first. But the longer it went on, the stranger it felt. He barely touched the notebook he'd brought with him. Mostly, he just watched me while pretending to glance around the room. At one point, I noticed he wasn't carrying any library books, no laptop charger, and nothing you'd expect from someone spending the evening studying, just that notebook. I remember suddenly becoming hyper-aware of how empty the floor had gotten. The rain outside had intensified too, rattling softly against the tall windows. I decided to pack up and relocate downstairs near the cafe area, where a few people still lingered. As I zipped my bag, the man looked disappointed for half a second before smiling again. "Leaving already?" he asked. I lied and said I was meeting classmates downstairs. He nodded slowly and leaned back in his chair, but while I walked toward the stairwell, I could feel his eyes following me the entire time. The second I reached the next floor, I stopped and looked back upward through the stairwell gap. He was standing now, not gathering his things, not studying, just standing at the railing above, staring down at me. I immediately headed towards the front information desk, near the entrance level, where an overnight facilities worker was organizing returned books. I casually mentioned the situation, mostly because saying it aloud made me feel less ridiculous. The worker listened carefully and asked me to point the man out discreetly. When we both glanced toward the upper floor, he was gone. That somehow made things worse. The worker offered to let me stay near the desk area until I finished my notes. I thanked him and sat there for another hour pretending to work while constantly glancing toward the elevators. Every time the doors opened, my stomach tightened a little. By midnight, the building was closing. A small group of us filtered out together into the wet parking lot. The rain had eased into a misty drizzle, and the campus pathways looked almost silver beneath the streetlights. I parked several blocks away near the arts building, because the closer lots were always full during finals week. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I slowed slightly. The footsteps slowed too. I crossed toward another walkway. So did the footsteps. That cold feeling spread through my chest instantly. I didn't turn around right away because some part of me still hoped I was overreacting. But after another 20 seconds, I finally glanced back. The man from the library was walking at the opposite end of the path. It was quite unsettling. He moved calmly, confidently, almost like he already knew where I was headed. The moment our eyes met, he smiled again. I immediately called my coworker Maya and started speaking loudly, pretending she was waiting nearby. The man slowed down slightly, but didn't stop walking. I changed direction completely and headed toward a brightly lit graduate housing courtyard, where several adults were sitting under an awning talking. The second I approached the group, the man stopped. For a few moments he just stood there, near the edge of the walkway, partially hidden behind a tree, while rain drifted through the light around him. Then he turned around and disappeared back into the darkness between the buildings. I stayed with those strangers nearly 40 minutes before finally asking one of them to walk me to my car, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened 2 weeks later. I returned to the same library floor during the afternoon, broad daylight, crowded building, completely normal atmosphere. I remember finally feeling silly about the whole thing. Like maybe I'd exaggerated it in my head because I was stressed and exhausted. Then I saw the notebook. It was sitting on the exact same table where the man had first approached me, and written across the front in black marker were just 3 words. "You notice details." After that, I stopped staying late at the library entirely. I started choosing different study spots across town, even if they were less convenient. And whenever I do go back, I make sure I'm nowhere near that section of the building. It's not even a conscious decision anymore. I just avoid it. The creepiest people don't usually look dangerous at first. They look ordinary enough that you keep second-guessing your instincts. That's exactly what happened to me during a late shift inside a university law library in Arizona. Looking back, I think I only got out safely because one employee noticed something I didn't. My name is Derek, I'm 34, and I was working remotely as a contract researcher for a publishing company. Most of my work involved legal records and archived court documents, so I spent a lot of evenings inside libraries for access to databases I couldn't get at home. The University Law Library downtown became my regular spot for almost 6 months. It was extremely quiet and serious. Nearly everybody there was a graduate student, professor, or professional preparing for certification exams. Even during busy hours, people barely spoke above whispers. I usually arrived around 6 p.m. and stayed until closing. By then, most daytime visitors had left, so the atmosphere became calmer. You'd hear keyboards clicking, printers in distant rooms, or the occasional chair squeak between shelves. One Tuesday night in late October, heavy wind rattled the windows while rain poured outside. The library emptied faster than usual. By 9:30 p.m., entire sections were nearly deserted. I was on the 3rd floor reviewing scanned documents when someone sat directly across from me. What immediately struck me was how unnecessary it was for him to sit there. The area was practically empty, yet he chose the table facing mine. He looked late 30s, neatly dressed, dark jacket, nothing unusual. He smiled politely and opened a thick legal textbook. I nodded and went back to work. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed he wasn't reading. Every few minutes, I'd glance up and catch him already looking at me before pretending to check his book. Eventually, he asked if I knew whether the library stayed open past midnight during exam season. The question wasn't strange, but the way he asked made me pause. I told him it closed at midnight except weekends. Then he asked whether security checked every floor before locking up. That bothered me more. I gave a vague answer and went back to my laptop, hoping it would end there. Instead, he kept asking small questions about busy floors at night, side entrances, and whether students walked alone to parking garages. None of it sounded directly threatening, but it left me uneasy. After about 20 minutes, I moved to another section near the reference shelves. For a while, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Then I saw him again. He was at the end of the aisle with the same textbook, scanning shelf labels. When he noticed me, he smiled and turned away. At that point, I was genuinely uncomfortable. The more I watched him, the stranger he seemed. He rarely stayed seated, moving between floors and stopping near isolated study areas before disappearing again. Around 10:45, the third floor was almost empty. Rain hammered the windows while thunder rolled outside, and the lighting felt dimmer as sections were shut down. I decided to head downstairs toward the main atrium where a few people were still studying. As I stepped into the elevator, the man entered at the last second. Neither of us spoke. Halfway down, he asked, "Do you usually stay until closing?" I pretended not to hear him. The doors opened and I walked straight out without responding. I sat near two graduate students under brighter lighting. The man exited a few seconds later and stood near a bulletin board, watching. Something about it felt deliberate, like he wanted me aware of him without approaching. About 10 minutes later, an overnight employee came to my table and quietly asked if I knew the man near the printers. I said no immediately. She explained staff had been watching him because he kept entering restricted hallways and asking unusual questions. He'd even tried following someone into a staff stairwell. My eyes widened. She told me to stay in populated areas and added he hadn't signed the visitor log, meaning nobody knew who he was. For the next half hour, staff monitored him quietly. He stayed calm, moving between shelves like an ordinary visitor. Then, around 11:40, things changed. The employee returned and said he'd somehow accessed the fourth floor, which was already locked. No one understood how. From below, we heard faint footsteps overhead moving slowly between aisles. Even students noticed something was wrong. Staff kept glancing up toward the balcony while whispering. One employee went upstairs to check. He came back several minutes later, looking unsettled. The man was gone. The fourth floor had only one staircase and one elevator. Nobody had seen him come down. Yet the floor was empty except for a legal textbook left open on a table. The upper floors were locked early after that. At midnight, everyone began leaving because of the storm. I packed quickly, just wanting to get home. The employee asked if my car was nearby and offered to walk me there. At first, I almost refused, but I accepted. The rain fell in heavy torrents. Wind pushed water across the sidewalks as we hurried toward the garage. Then halfway across the street, one employee stopped. He said, "Don't look immediately." Of course I looked immediately. The man was standing near the garage entrance, partially in the shadows, watching. The moment he was noticed, he turned and walked into the rain without hurrying. None of us spoke after that. They walked me to my car. I sat inside afterward, replaying the night with the doors locked. I thought it was over. But 2 days later, I returned to the library and saw a printed notice near the entrance. Visitor access policies were being updated immediately, and overnight staff escorts were now available upon request. That small policy change told me that the employees understood exactly how serious that situation really was. Closing a library sounds easy until you start noticing every tiny sound once the building empties out. My name is Evan, I'm 27, and a few years ago I worked evening shifts at a private research library connected to a small cultural center downtown. It wasn't a huge public library packed with crowds all day. The place mainly catered to graduate students, historians, writers, and local professionals who needed access to archived collections and quiet workspaces. I had taken the job as a second source of income while freelancing as a graphic designer during the daytime. Most evenings I worked from 5:00 p.m. until closing at 10. The job itself was pretty relaxed most nights. I checked books back into the system, organized returns, cleaned study areas, and handled closing procedures after the other employees left. The building itself was beautiful, but unsettling after dark. It had 3 floors connected by narrow staircases with tall shelves packed tightly together across every level. Large reading tables sat beneath hanging brass lights, and the older sections still had original wooden flooring that creaked constantly whenever somebody walked through the aisles. During the day, the place felt calm and welcoming. At night, it felt completely different. Friday evenings were usually quiet because most people preferred being anywhere else by the end of the work week. That particular night in February had been slower than normal because a snowstorm was moving through the city. By around 8:30 p.m., only a handful of visitors remained scattered throughout the building. One of the senior librarians finished her shift around 9:15 and wished me a good weekend before leaving through the staff entrance. After that, I was alone handling closing duties. That wasn't unusual. I'd done it dozens of times already without problems. At 9:45, I made the first closing announcement over the intercom. A few remaining visitors started gathering their things while I pushed a cart through the second floor, collecting abandoned reference books. Outside the windows, snow blew sideways beneath the street lights while wind rattled faintly against the old glass panes. By 10, the building looked empty. I made the final announcement, walked the main floor, and watched the last 2 visitors leave through the front entrance carrying umbrellas against the snow. Once they disappeared down the sidewalk, I locked the doors and started my usual routine. First came shutting down public computers, then cleaning the study tables. Around 10:20, while shelving books on the 3rd floor, I heard a loud thump somewhere nearby. I stopped immediately. At first, I assumed a book had slipped off a shelf. That happened fairly often in older sections because some shelves leaned slightly unevenly. I walked through the nearest aisle, expecting to find something on the floor. Instead, I found an empty chair slowly rocking beside one of the study tables. That instantly unsettled me. The 3rd floor had been empty during my walkthrough earlier. I specifically remembered checking that section because people occasionally fell asleep in the corner study booths. But now one chair sat, pulled halfway away from the table like somebody had stood up only seconds earlier. I stood there listening for movement, but I heard nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself the chair had probably been turned when somebody left earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. I pushed it back beneath the table and returned to shelving books. But I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease from earlier. A few minutes later, I heard another sound. This time it came from the biography section farther down the floor. I set the cart aside and walked toward the aisle carefully. The overhead lighting in that area had already switched into nighttime mode, meaning every other row sat dimmer than the main pathways. Tall shadows stretched between shelves, making it hard to see very far ahead. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed 3 books lying open on the floor. What bothered me wasn't that they'd fallen. It was where they'd landed. The books formed almost a straight line leading deeper between the shelves, like somebody had dropped them while moving through the aisle. I remember standing there trying to decide whether I was overthinking things when I heard footsteps somewhere on the level below me. At that point, I became certain somebody was still inside the building. I walked quickly toward the staircase and called out, "Library's closed now, just so you know." No one responded. The footsteps stopped immediately. That silence afterward honestly felt worse. I headed downstairs expecting to find some distracted researcher still wandering around, maybe wearing headphones or completely losing track of time. But the 2nd floor looked empty when I reached it. The study tables sat untouched beneath dim lighting, while snow reflected faintly through the tall windows. Then I heard movement again, this time from the 1st floor. I started getting irritated more than nervous at that point. The building closed at 10 every night, and occasionally people did try lingering after hours, hoping nobody would notice. I walked downstairs toward the main reading area, ready to tell whoever it was that they needed to leave immediately. But the 1st floor was empty too. I checked the restrooms near the entrance. Empty. Conference rooms. Empty. Printer stations. Empty. By now I was genuinely confused. I returned to the circulation desk, trying to think logically about what I'd heard. Then I noticed something strange near the front entrance. One of the guest sign-in sheets had moved. At our library, visitors signed into a clipboard system near the desk after 6 p.m. because evening staffing was limited. Earlier that night, I distinctly remembered straightening the clipboard before locking the doors. Now the top page was folded backward, like somebody had recently flipped through it. I stepped closer and immediately saw a fresh signature at the bottom of the page. The moment I noticed that, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Every hair on my arms stood up instantly. I grabbed the building radio from behind the desk and called the overnight maintenance worker stationed in the neighboring cultural center next door. Thankfully, he answered immediately. I tried sounding calmer than I felt while explaining that somebody might still be inside the library after closing. He told me he'd come over right away. Those next few minutes felt unbelievably long. I stayed near the front desk, staring toward the staircase while listening carefully for more movement upstairs. Every so often I thought I heard faint shifting sounds somewhere above me, followed by silence again before I could pinpoint the location. Then, out of nowhere, the motion sensor lights on the second floor switched on. One section at a time, like somebody was walking slowly past them. I remember physically backing away from the staircase when I saw that. The maintenance worker arrived, maybe 3 minutes later, carrying a flashlight and looking more annoyed than concerned. Together we checked every floor carefully from top to bottom. What we found made the situation even stranger. Near the back corner of the third floor, several heavy art books had been pulled completely off the shelves and stacked neatly on one of the study tables. Beside them sat a ceramic coffee mug that definitely hadn't been there earlier. The coffee was still warm. Whoever had been inside must have left moments before we searched the floor, but there was no sign of anybody anywhere in the building. The maintenance worker eventually suggested somebody probably slipped out while I was downstairs checking rooms earlier. Maybe they panicked after realizing the building had closed and avoided me intentionally. Honestly, that explanation should made me feel better. It didn't, because while we were locking up for the second time, I glanced back toward the third floor balcony above the atrium, and for just a second, I could have sworn I saw someone standing between the shelves, watching us from the darkness, before quietly stepping backward out of sight. If you enjoyed these unsettling library horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Horror for more true creepy encounters and late night stories that'll keep you looking over your shoulder. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload, because the next story might be even stranger than this one.